Can you start us off with a little bit of history? Why do we have a State of the Union address? And I mean it specifically now. We have a 24-hour news cycle. So is it still the reason to do this? Do those reasons still exist?
Well, the basic reason is that to this day, it's a requirement of the Constitution, which says that a president of the United States shall from time to time report to Congress. And that was done in somewhat a low-key way. For much of American history, it was done in writing. But the big change, Katie, was 1966. Lyndon Johnson was president. And I won't do my bad Lyndon Johnson imitation, but he said, you know, why are we having a president do this at noontime when people are at work? Why don't we do it on primetime TV? That's when this began. And so the result is that since 1966, fluctuates, but this has been one of the biggest platforms a president of the United States can have, especially in an election year like now.
Your thoughts about the fact that the GOP has selected Alabama Senator Katie Britt to be able to give the Republican response or retort to Biden's Thursday night State of the Union. Obviously, Alabama has been in the spotlight within the last few days, considering the decision from the Alabama Supreme Court on IVF. And Alabama is always kind of making the headlines for the worst reasons. Your thoughts about what you anticipate her role is going to be on Thursday?
Well, you know, it's like Abraham Lincoln used to say that his speech would be little noted or long remembered. I'm afraid that's true of most responses to State of the Union addresses. I mean, how many can you and I quote from? But this year, bad luck for the Republicans that they have set up Joe Biden to talk about IVF, to talk about Alabama, and basically force her into a position where she's going to have to reply to that very majority view that IVF should be preserved.
Michael, I also wanted to have you on, and timing is what it is, to talk about the fact that we're now looking at a United States Supreme Court that always has its lowest ratings in terms of trustworthiness from Americans, that they've now decided to give Donald Trump the grace of the space of taking up the time to address this idea that Donald Trump is king, that he has absolute immunity. I mean, considering the breadth of your knowledge about American presidencies, American presidents, what they've stood for, what they've fallen for, your thoughts about the fact that the Supreme Court would actually take up this decision and whether you could predict what you think this particular SCOTUS would do?
Well, there's every sign that this is a way of buying time for Donald Trump by a Supreme Court majority or close to a majority that perhaps would like to see him elected. I wouldn't say that about almost any other Supreme Court in American history. It has now become extremely political, and we Americans are absolutely right in being very dubious and skeptical of the motives of the people who made this decision. Are we to believe that the Supreme Court is taking this on because they think it's an absolutely defensible notion that a president can hire, as was said in public not long ago, SEAL Team 6 to assassinate his political opponents? I mean, if this were something that was very much in the balance, you'd want the Supreme Court to weigh in. But if a majority of Americans feel that this is a cheap political way of delaying perhaps two trials, federal trials, that could damage Donald Trump in an election year, then the Supreme Court's, reclam, which is already extremely low, is going to sink in a way that's really dangerous.
Have we reached some measure of a historical inflection point then, Michael, when it comes to the blurring of the lines of the branches that are supposed to be separate? Your executive branch being separate from your judiciary, and one not controlling the other or being unduly influenced or swayed by the other. The other idea of church and state being separate. Again, I reference that IVF decision where there was repeated references to the Bible in that particular decision. I mean, are we at a point where those lines of demarcation no longer exist?
These discussions are on the table in a way that certainly you and I have not seen during our lifetimes. And for most of American history, all of those ideas were off the table. The idea that church and state should be separated, that Congress would be separated from the executive branch. Donald Trump has made it quite clear that if he gets to be president, if there's a Republican majority in Congress, he expects it to do what he tells them. That is totally un-American, as you well know, against James Madison and against the Constitution. And as for these Supreme Court justices that seem to be very eager to help Donald Trump to become president, they should remember that in dictatorships, if there is something like a Supreme Court, the Supreme Court almost quickly becomes irrelevant. That will happen to them this year if Donald Trump does get elected, does dominate Congress, and does go through with his plans to become a dictator. That's how serious this is.